study here, is that correct?
Oh, I think it's been here since 2017. Yeah, so even more than that. We've switched the varieties and the fungicide treatments, but we've been running this here since that time.
So
yep.
Where can we find those studies over that period of time? Are they somewhere on the web that we can find them or not?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we have that. Well, it's in a paper. We don't have an extension pub. Probably our next piece should be putting together an extension pub on that. Well, so the kind of easiest summary of that is every year we summarize fungicide efficacy in our fungicide efficacy guide, and I should have printed those. So we have our Kansas wheat fungicide efficacy guide that we put out every year, and that's the place where we really summarize the product results here. So we'll have a lot of information there, but one of the key pieces is we'll say how well a certain product works against a certain disease. So for example, we have a column there for Scab, a lot of the currently labeled fungicide products, and then we'll have a score for each product, right? So excellent to poor or not labeled. So that's kind of a place where it's partially summarized, but the research paper is the place to get the results, the long-term results. But I probably should put together you've always given me great ideas, Sandra. I should put together an extension pub with these results specifically. Yep.
Well, that's okay. And the efficacy trial usually comes out in August. Is that right? Every year, or when does that come out?
That one usually we'll put that out in February, March timeframe. So kind of right after we've summarized the last year's data. And that one we actually blast out. So that's a multi-state effort. So we'll summarize data from 10 states.
Okay.
So we'll include this and other observations from 10 states. And then we put that out every year in that March timeframe right before we're moving into the season. Yep.
Thanks.
Yeah, thanks. Good question.
Kelsey, is this your only location, or do you have it spread out across the state?
So we have this specific trial here and in Manhattan. So we've done this there, and this is more of a dry land study. So the other piece of this is we use this to fit the model too, so that forecasting model. So in years like this where we didn't get very good Scab, that tells us something, right? So we can use the weather data here to update the model. So that's another thing that we have kind of going on in the background here. And then we have two other locations that are inoculated and irrigated, where we also test fungicides, one in Manhattan and one in Ottawa, on the station there in Ottawa. And that's a different type of inoculation. We get consistent disease there every year, but we also supplement with some mist irrigation to make sure we have all the pieces of the puzzle there for disease. So those would be two locations, other Scab locations that we have. Yep. We have another Scab trial. It's a little bit different. On a producer field around the Salina area. So that's a slightly different set of questions. So if anyone has a Scab field and they want us to put a trial there where you're consistently getting Scab, nobody wants that, but sometimes we can make lemonade with lemons.
So how do you ensure that the government is kind of distributed uniformly?
So in this trial, we actually spray each plot with a fixed volume and a fixed number of spores. So we come in with a backpack CO2 sprayer, similar to how we'll apply small plot fungicides, and we apply a certain amount of spores. So we feel pretty confident, and we've looked at that a number of times, that we get the same number of spores on these plots at the same time. Sometimes we'll have to do that over multiple days. We try to pick varieties with similar maturities so we don't have this flowering component. So usually they're flowering at the same time. If they're not, we'll have to do it over kind of a multi-day period.
And then how does this one compare with the natural residual corn?
Yeah, that's a good question. So we're kind of bypassing the corn there. So the corn, you'll get actually those ascospores and macroconidia releasing from the corn residue. They actually shoot up pretty fast, like amazingly fast. So here, instead of relying on them shooting up from that corn residue, we'll just apply a mix of the macroconidia and the ascospores to the top. So you can, when we compare this to our like corn kernel inoculations, we'll usually have, you know, similar success if we have good conditions. That's kind of the key piece here. Well, good. Another key question I get a lot is, will my flag leaf fungicide give me any scab protection? Unfortunately, no, right? So that's one of the big issues here. So sometimes we like to, if we need to spray for scab, if we can kind of delay that flag leaf application just a little bit, if stripe rust or something else is coming on late, or we have a variety that has good stripe rust, right? We can kind of wait for that scab application. That's a nice strategy if we can do it, right, in a low stripe rust year. And then the products that work very well for scab, like Moravis and these other products here, they're all very effective for stripe rust too, right? So that's the good news. Not every stripe rust fungicide works for scab, but every scab fungicide works for stripe rust. So
is the fungicide strategy then err on the side of rust rather than scab whenever you're talking about timing?
Well, I think especially if you're not going back after corn, right? So I think that's the kind of the key piece there. We do have parts of the state, if we go kind of east here and especially south, where scab's a more perennial issue, more moisture. But here, and especially if you're not back on corn and you're not under pivot, yeah, I would be much more concerned. It seems like stripe rust has been a more frequent issue over the last 5 years. So that would be the first thing I'd be tuned into. Yep, that's a great point.
$5 and the mills don't care right now.
Exactly.
So just out of curiosity, I guess.
It depends on, so, you know, in our work, you do definitely get an additional benefit. So I think we were at kind of 80% control with the this type of variety, right? And then we could get up to 98%. So you kind of get up an extra 15-20% if you're applying a fungicide. And we did see, you know, and then it depends, right? So that's a bad answer, but it depends on how high risk the situation is, how much, if there's history of scab in the field, if you're back into corn stalks and the weather is perfect, because, you know, the risk for scab is in those rare years where everything lines up. And then we get rejected, right? Because it doesn't take much scab. If you see higher than 10% scab in your field, you can be at that risk, right, for having DON that goes above 2 parts per million or whatever they're setting the threshold at. So that's a wishy-washy answer. So you can do a lot with a variety like this, and that's the safest thing to do, right? Because you do that you don't have to make any decisions later, right? You pick a variety, you know you're going in to a higher risk field, right? But then on those high risk years, you can still definitely get a benefit from a fungicide. But the economics, yeah. And so we just had a paper looking at, you know, kind of your fungicide benefit in a susceptible variety by how much scab you have, right? So it looked like at 10%. If you look out of the field, now this is hard to do because you can't know until after you need to spray your fungicide. But if you just have some scab, you know, less than 10% of your heads are affected, we didn't see that ever paying off, right? So you just didn't get the yield gain or the toxin protection that would be necessary to kind of be profitable in that scenario that we looked at. But if you have those higher, if you get up into 15, 20, 30, 40% of the heads affected, that's when that fungicide can make a huge difference. You can be looking at a 35 bushel loss, right? And 20+% part per million toxin. So definitely if at those higher levels, the fungicide is necessary and can pay.
For the time that this trial's been going on, what's been the most consistent combination of variety and treatment in terms of like best outcome?
So the best outcome has been a variety. Well, before this year we had Zenda. So this year hasn't been harvested yet, so let's see. But we had Zenda, which is similar to 4401 in terms of resistance. And then adding plus Moravis has been our best outcome.
Okay.
Moravisace at flowering, plus that moderately resistant variety like Zenda has been the best treatment.
And you say 4401 in terms of its characteristics is kind of a successor variety to Zenda in that case?
Similar scab resistance.
Okay.
Yep, similar scab resistance. I don't know, Alan, if you're probably biting your tongue there.
I mean, I think the comment that you made about if you're worried about scab, so if you're going into those corn residue situations, then picking a variety that has moderate resistance really makes a lot of sense. It also makes a lot of sense to pay attention to the stripe rust rating, because if we get an early infection of stripe rust, you're going to need a stripe rust fungicide and you're going to need the scab fungicide, and that's not really a good economic solution. So choosing something that has reasonable level of stripe rust resistance, which would be 4401, AP prolific, and then Providence will hold off stripe rust most of the time to be able to do that. So there are some other things, like 4699 has a reasonable level of scab resistance, but it's kind of flaming susceptible to stripe rust, so that kind of takes some management tools out of your toolbox. So kind of picking that stripe rust resistant variety with the moderate resistance, I think, lets you manage it better. And then it's just kind of monitoring your risk. I think the model is good, and if you're hitting a bunch of wet weather right around flowering and you know you're in a high risk situation with corn residue, then I think that's when the decision to put a fungicide on makes a ton of sense.
Right, yeah, thank you. Well, for time's sake, we better keep rolling. I could talk about scab all day, but I know we've got other things to talk about. So